Good afternoon, everybody. Today, we are picking up where we left off with our lesson on ecology. We're going to talk a little bit today about the factors that can really limit a species or a population's presence in an ecosystem. Yesterday, we used an example of an aquarium, and we talked about how the different factors in the aquarium all play into each other in order for the animals to survive. Today we're going to look at not how the animals interact with each other, but just different factors that can limit the presence of a species in an ecosystem. And aptly named, these are going to be called limiting factors. When we think of a limiting factor, one of the easiest things to think of is space, right? So if we think to an aquarium, if I have, a small aquarium, it's not going to fit 500 fish in it. It's going to fit 10 to 15. And so that is a limiting factor in and of itself. It's a really easy one to think of because it's very easy to picture and very easy to imagine. But we're going to look at it a little bit in more depth where we have, not only how many organisms there are, but we look at the resources, we look at the predators, we look at all the rest. So if we look at the slide here, limiting factors, they are resources and predators. They can limit the amount of organisms that exist in a system, right? So if I only have enough food for 20 organisms, I can only have 20 organisms there. If there are predators present, they're going to eat prey. So if there's a lot of predators, there's going to be less prey because they're going to eat the prey. If there's more prey, they can have a bigger population of predators. If there are any adaptations that take place in order to let the prey hide more, then we're going to see a change in the number of predators. All these things are going to interact and change because of it. Certain organisms also have limiting factors that apply to them, right? There's saltwater fish versus freshwater fish. If you have a fish from the ocean and you try to keep it in fresh water, it won't survive in the fresh water. And vice versa is true as well, right? If you take a freshwater fish and you put it into salt water, it will die there as well. The ecosystem itself can influence that. That could be a limiting factor as well. If you take a plant from the rainforest and you try to grow it in the desert, it's obviously not going to grow there. And the same can be true if we flip those situations as well, right? A cactus from the desert will drown if you put it in a rainforest, right? They have these adaptations, they have these processes that they do that specifically limit the type of environment they can be in. Right? Temperature is true of this as well. Changing the temperature will change the type of organism that lives there. We have certain animals that will shed their outer layer of fur when the seasons change, but if it's even too hot for that, then an animal won't survive, right? You have a polar bear can't live in the desert, right? A camel can't live in the Arctic. We know these things intuitively, but they're going to play roles in our ecosystems, and as we look at them, we're going to see that effect. When we talk about a population's ability to live in an area, we want to talk about the carrying capacity of that population. We want to say, well, how many fish can fit in this tank before there start to be issues? And that is what we're looking at. It's a combination taking into account of all of the factors that we're talking about, right? It's the temperature, it's the nutrients, it's the number of prey, number of predators. All these things are going to impact just how many of each organism can fit in a ecosystem. Right, right? So classes are a good example of this, right? A room with 34 seats can hold a maximum of 34 students. If we start putting more students into those seats, we're going to have a problem. We're going to have people fighting for seats. Right? We have a carrying capacity in our regular classroom of 34 students. The organisms that are going to live in these areas, the organisms that are going to be in an ecosystem together, are either going to be in direct competition with one another for resources, right? The sparrows and the pigeons are going to fight for the same seeds, the same insects, the same worms, the same everything, because they're going to try to fit in the same role. Or they're going to be directly competing with each other in terms of survivability, right? The owl is going to compete with the sparrow to see if the sparrow can get away fast enough before the owl eats it. We're going to reach an equilibrium with a population in an area where they're going to grow up to their carrying capacity and kind of hover and bounce right around that area, right? If we think about mice in a field, right? If they can hold 100 mice, right? There's enough resources, enough materials, enough living spaces for 100 mice to exist there, and they get to 100 mice. When there's 110 mice, well, 10 of them are going to die out, right? There's only enough room for 100. And if, let's say, it's a harsher winter and now there's 90 mice, there's enough room for 10 mice to grow. For 10 mice to be born to kind of get us back to 100. And as we see on our chart here, if there's a growth and there's an overshoot like this is going to allow for more prey to come in and eat these extra, because there's not enough hiding spots, or there's not enough resources, so some of them are going to die. And when they die out, we end up with a deficit, right, where we're now below the carrying capacity, and the mice or the organism is going to reproduce and try to bounce up, and we're going to have this constant, right, bounce of over under as we hover in between at this carrying capacity line. Carrying capacities are flexible, right? If there's more predators, right? Let's stick to calling this the mice, right? If we're calling these mice, if there's more owls, right, or more snakes, or more predators that are going to then eat those mice, the carrying capacity is going to decrease, because now there's more predators, there's more things actively hunting for mice. And so we're going to have a carrying capacity, if I could draw a straight line, that is lower than it was before. If the owls or the snakes or whatever is hunting the mice die out, we can have a carrying capacity that is now higher than it was before. Right? It is a flexible number. It's just a kind of collection and analysis of all of these factors that limit a population, right? If we think about the temperature, the amount of resources, the amount of predators, the amount of hiding spots, all of these things are going to come together to give us our carrying capacity, and whether it's really high or really low or in the middle depends on the other factors. Competition is another thing that's going to influence our carrying capacity. It's another one of our limiting factors. There's different types of competition, right? For example, we have this here. If wolves kill a large amount of deer and their population grows, they need to compete for the remaining deer. So hunting the prey, the successful wolves are going to survive and the unsuccessful wolves are going to die. The same thing goes on the opposite end of that, if we look at it from the deer's perspective, the deer that are faster and better at hiding are going to outlive the deer that are worse at hiding or slower. And that's going to be competition. It doesn't need to be, doesn't have to be competition over resources. It just be competition of, who survives the longest, who's the best at hunting, who's the best at hiding. If we talk about plants, we can talk about their competition for sunlight. That's why there's always trees that are fighting for dominance in terms of height. A taller tree gets more sunlight because there's less stuff blocking it. And we have adaptations for the smaller plants on the floor of the forest that allows them to adjust accordingly to having less sunlight. This is why things like a Venus flytrap developed over time, because they weren't getting enough sunlight, and so they needed some other way to get nutrients. And capturing flies and digesting flies is going to be a lot more nutrients than trying to get, a single ray of sunlight. So competition is a big factor that helps us then determine carrying capacity, and they're going to influence each other a lot. The competition between different types of animals that are all in the same ecosystem are going to come together to have carrying capacities for all of these things that are going to vary. Right? If there's a lot of wolves, then we're going to have a carrying capacity for much fewer deer. And if there's a lot of deer, that'll then raise the carrying capacity for wolves because there's more food for them. Things like that, they're all going to be interconnected. It's a little bit more than just survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is the competition aspect of it. But when we're not looking at this from an animal's point of view. We will be in a little bit, looking at the bigger picture. So survival of the fittest comes into play at the competition level right here where we are. But when we look at a food web or a food chain, we're looking at how these populations are going to impact each other. Right? If the wolves all of a sudden get better at hunting, then they're going to kill off a lot of the deer. And if they kill off all the deer, then there's going to be no food for them, so they're going to die out themselves, and they're going to have an ecosystem that collapses. Survival of the fittest, again, does play a role, but it's not the entirety of it. In terms of competition, we also want to talk about a niche. And it's a fairly common enough word in the English language, but when we talk about a niche here, we talk about habitat and feeding style. What role does an organism play in the ecosystem as a whole? So before, when I was talking about competition over resources, I was talking about pigeons and sparrows and how they're going to both go for the same crumbs on the street, the same worms, the same seeds, the same breadcrumbs. Those are going to be two animals that are trying to occupy the same niche. They're both having the same habitat, they both have the same feeding style. But if, for example, the sparrows only ate bugs and worms and the pigeons only ate breadcrumbs, then they wouldn't be competing for resources. They would occupy different niches, even if they had the same habitat. If one of these things is different, then they occupy a different niche. Being an omnivore or a carnivore or an herbivore plays into the niche that an organism occupies, right? That goes into the feeding style. But it's also including the habitat that these organisms live in. So you can have birds that live at the very tippy top of trees in the forest versus birds that live closer to the ground in the forest that both eat the same thing, and those are two different niches because they live in different spots. Right? If we had two birds that both lived at near the floor of the forest, and then also fought over the same materials, only one of them would be able to win out, because by occupying that same living area, right, occupying that same habitat, and having the same food source, they're competing with each other as well as being hunted by the same things. Right? So there could only be one in that case, and that's where survival of the fittest plays a bigger role here. If we have two organisms that are trying to occupy the same niche. Yes, a niche is what the organism does in the ecosystem, right? It's the role that it plays, its part in the whole thing. And then down at the bottom here we have an example, right? Many birds can be in a forest because they live at different heights in the trees. They eat different types of food. If they lived at the same height, right? They all lived at the top of the trees. They all lived at the bottom of the trees, and they all ate the same food. They would be competing with each other instead of working harmoniously. They would all be hunted by the same things. They would all be hunting the same things, which would put them in direct competition for each other for survival. And then today's lesson is actually a little shorter because I want to spend a lot of time tomorrow on food chains and food webs. Um, so we're actually going to stop here, right, talking about niches and carrying capacity and competition, so that tomorrow we can come and spend the full half hour, the full time looking at food chains, food webs, and how we're going to see those in the future. So thank you for tuning in. I will transition this into tutoring and office hours in 2-3 minutes, as soon as I clean up this stream and then start another. Take care, everybody.